Iwo Jima, February 1945. A strip of volcanic earth where nothing felt alive except the gunfire. The air was thick with sulfur, smoke, and the distant tremble of artillery. On this island, every sound meant something, and every mistake could be the last one a man ever made. In the middle of that chaos, an American flamethrower team pushed forward. Their tanks of fuel clanged softly as they moved, heavy on their backs, shining faintly under the gray sky. Behind them, riflemen provided the standard covering fire, predictable, steady, drilled into them 1,000 times. A rhythm everyone trusted. But one soldier saw what others didn't. He noticed how the Japanese snipers had learned this rhythm. How they waited for the exact second when covering fire paused, then struck with terrifying precision. He watched several flamethrower operators fall in the same way, to the same pattern. To him, the rule meant death. He lay in the hot black sand, his breath shallow, his heart pressing against his ribs. He knew that if he followed the rule, the flamethrower in front of him would be shot within moments. And so he made a decision few soldiers would dare to make. He aimed his rifle, not toward the target everyone expected, but toward an empty patch of rock far away from the flamethrower's path. He squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the humid air, echoing off stone and sand. That single shot broke doctrine. Broke training. Broke trust. No one around him understood. No one could see what he saw. But in that moment, far in the distance, a Japanese sniper reacted, firing toward the false signal, away from the real threat. It worked. He had deceived an enemy trained to read patterns. But the danger wasn't over. If anyone from his command realized he was firing in the wrong direction, he could be court-martialed on the spot. Disobedience under fire wasn't a mistake, it was a crime. One that could cost him his life. Still, he chambered another round. Because in those few seconds of stolen safety, the flamethrower team advanced. They lived. And he knew that the only thing standing between them and a sniper's bullet was his next lie. As he prepared to fire again, he felt eyes turning toward him, American eyes. The echo of that false shot still hung in the air when he steadied his breathing again. The sand beneath him was hot, almost burning through his uniform, but he couldn't shift positions. Any movement might break the illusion he was trying to create. He wiped a layer of sweat mixed with volcanic dust from his cheek and prepared for the next deceptive shot. Around him, the Marines kept firing in disciplined bursts, organized, predictable, exactly as they were trained. He felt the contrast sharply. Their rhythm was familiar, steady, almost mechanical. His rhythm was chaos. A pattern designed to look like a mistake, to draw the eyes of an unseen enemy. He fired again, this time farther to the left, striking nothing more than a blackened stone. The sound cracked through the air, different from the others. Offbeat. Wrong. But perfectly wrong. A second later, the response came. A Japanese sniper took the bait again, sending a round directly into the false target. The sand around the stone exploded upward. It worked twice. That was no accident. The enemy believed the lie. He felt a surge of adrenaline, but he kept his face expressionless. He couldn't celebrate. He couldn't speak. He could only keep lying with his rifle and pray no Marine asked the question forming silently in their eyes. The man in the foxhole next to him turned his head, brows tightening. He'd noticed. Not enough to accuse him, but enough to wonder. Enough to remember. On a battlefield, suspicion could grow faster than smoke. Still, the rifleman didn't stop. He fired a third deceptive shot, then a fourth. Each one placed carefully, not too fast, not too slow, just irregular enough to feel like panic or bad judgment. But inside the caves and tunnels ahead, the snipers were adjusting their aim. He could almost sense it, like distant tremors running through the battlefield. They were tracking ghosts, the ghosts he created. The flamethrower team, still unaware, advanced a few precious feet. That movement meant everything. In Iwo Jima's killing fields, a few feet could be the difference between burning out a bunker or dying before reaching it. And yet with every passing second, the danger on his side grew. Officers didn't tolerate deviation under fire. Marines were expected to follow orders without hesitation. A man firing wildly could be accused of panic, or worse, cowardice. And cowardice in the middle of combat had a punishment harsher than enemy bullets. He knew the risk. He felt it tightening around him like a noose with each false round he fired. Then, suddenly, a voice in the distance. Short. Sharp. Commanding. Someone was calling out down the line. Not to him, not yet, but close enough to freeze his blood. Something had caught their attention. And he feared it wasn't the enemy. A shadow moved toward him through the smoke, someone coming to find out what he was doing. The shadow moved closer, slow but deliberate, cutting through drifting smoke as if the battlefield were parting to reveal a truth he didn't want anyone to see. The rifleman steadied himself, heart pounding against the inside of his helmet. He knew that if the wrong man reached him now, the deception would end, not because the Japanese stopped falling for it, but because his own side would. He pressed his body lower into the black volcanic sand, its grains rough and hot against his skin. He tried to appear focused, calm, like a Marine simply scanning for threats. His finger hovered near the trigger, but he hesitated. If he fired too soon, the pattern would look intentional. If he waited too long, it would look suspicious. The figure approaching became clearer, a fellow Marine, not an officer, yet someone senior enough to question him. The man slid into a shallow dip in the sand beside him, breathing hard, helmet tilted forward, eyes sharp from the stress of combat. He shouted something over the gunfire, but the words vanished into the wind. The rifleman fired again to mask the moment, an intentionally misplaced shot. The crack echoed. Almost immediately, a Japanese sniper responded, biting the bait again and striking the empty mound. The Marine beside him froze. His eyes widened slightly as dust erupted from the false target. He followed the bullet's path back to the rifleman's barrel. Understanding flickered across his face, confusion mixed with realization. For a second, an unbearable silence existed between them. Not spoken silence, knowing silence. The rifleman braced himself. If this Marine called him out, pointed a finger, shouted a single word like wrong direction, that was it. Officers would be on him in minutes. Military law was clear and unforgiving. But then something unexpected happened. The Marine next to him didn't shout. He didn't judge. Instead, he raised his own rifle and fired toward another harmless rock farther up the ridge. A second later, another Japanese bullet smashed into that false target. 2 lies. 2 Marines. And the enemy was falling for both. The rifleman stared, breathless. The man had understood, not the logic, not the full plan, but the effect. He didn't need explanation. He could see with his own eyes that the deception was drawing fire away from the flamethrower team now edging toward a fortified bunker. Together, they created noise, scattered shots, misleading bursts, shadows on the battlefield. Their rifles became instruments of confusion, bending the enemy's perception with every irregular burst. But the danger doubled too. 1 Marine firing strangely was suspicious. 2 Marines doing it, that was a pattern officers couldn't ignore. Somewhere behind them, a voice barked an order. Louder this time. Closer. The Marine beside him stiffened. The rifleman's stomach dropped. Someone was coming again. And this time, it wasn't a fellow soldier. It was authority. Through the drifting smoke, he saw the outline of an officer marching straight toward their position. The officer's figure cut through the haze like a blade. His steps were controlled, deliberate, the kind that carried authority even in a storm of bullets. Marines parted instinctively when they saw someone like him moving forward. Rank had a presence of its own on the battlefield, and this one carried the weight of absolute expectation. The rifleman felt his pulse quicken. His hands tightened around the stock, suddenly too aware of the heat radiating from the metal. The Marine beside him swallowed hard, shifting just enough to pretend he was adjusting his aim. But nothing could hide the strange pattern of fire the officer had surely noticed. 2 Marines, firing off-beat, firing in directions far from the objective, it was too obvious. The officer dropped to one knee beside them. His boots kicked up a faint cloud of black sand. His jaw was locked, eyes sharp and scanning the ridge ahead. For a moment, he said nothing. The silence felt heavier than gunfire. Then he spoke, calm, clipped, the voice of a man who had seen too many battles to waste breath on fear. He asked what they were targeting. A simple question. A dangerous one. The kind that demanded an answer neither of them could give. The rifleman felt his throat tighten. Lying to an officer in combat was as deadly as disobeying orders. But telling the truth, that he was breaking protocol to deceive snipers, was worse. It would mean immediate arrest, maybe execution, and the deception would end. The flamethrower team ahead would be exposed again, and likely killed. Before he could speak, a sudden crack split the air. A Japanese sniper fired, another perfectly misplaced shot, slamming into the same empty rock the rifleman had targeted earlier. Sand burst upward like a small explosion. The officer turned, eyes narrowing as he tracked the dust plume. He followed the bullet's direction, then looked back at the rifleman. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. And something changed. The officer wasn't stupid. He had survived long enough to recognize patterns, and breaks in patterns. He had seen Marines panic, and he had seen Marines think under pressure. This, whatever it was, didn't look like panic. It looked intentional. It looked controlled. He shifted his position again, glancing toward the flamethrower team creeping forward behind a low ridge. They were still alive. Advancing. Unusually safe. A realization flickered across the officer's expression, too subtle to read fully, too complex to name. But the rifleman felt it, the moment authority sensed something it wasn't supposed to acknowledge. Then, surprisingly, the officer lifted his own rifle, and fired toward the same useless patch of rock the sniper had just struck. The battlefield cracked open again. Another Japanese sniper took the bait. 3 men now, 3 lies woven together. The rifleman felt a shiver run through him. He didn't know if the officer understood the full plan, or simply acted on instinct. But in that moment, rank and regulation faded beneath something older, something primal. Survival. Still, the danger didn't disappear. Far behind them, another group of Marines had begun to notice the unusual direction of their shots. Whispered confusion spread down the line. Suspicion was growing. And an officer joining the deception didn't erase the risk, it multiplied it. Because officers had commanding officers too. Cliffhanger. A radio call crackled behind them, a superior officer summoning their squad for immediate clarification. The radio crackled with sharp urgency, cutting through the gunfire like a blade across steel. Every Marine nearby turned instinctively. Orders delivered over radio were never casual. They carried weight, and consequences. The officer stiffened, leaning closer as the voice on the other end demanded a status update from his position. Too firm. Too direct. Someone higher up had noticed the irregular shooting. The rifleman felt his chest tighten. The deception had spread too far. A single Marine could get away with strange shots. 2 Marines were harder to justify. But when an officer joined them, when their fire pattern diverged from the entire line, the command structure would react. It had to. Battlefields depended on control. Predictable fire, synchronized moves, shared understanding. And what they were doing now looked like chaos. Worse, it looked like insubordination. The officer clicked the radio once, acknowledging the call without speaking. His eyes scanned the ridge, then locked onto the flamethrower team crawling closer to the bunker entrance. They were just meters away from the kill zone snipers normally owned. Yet no bullet had reached them since the deception began. The officer hesitated. That hesitation said everything. He understood the effect, even if he didn't understand the full strategy. He understood enough to know that explaining this over the radio would be impossible. Explaining that they were intentionally misleading snipers by firing at empty rocks. That they were breaking doctrine to save a team. That he, an officer, had fired at nothing on purpose. No one would believe it. and no one in command would accept it. The rifleman waited for the officer's decision. It felt like waiting for a verdict. His palms were slick with sweat. Each heartbeat thudded inside his helmet. If the officer chose to obey the radio order immediately, everything would end. They would be pulled back, questioned, disciplined. And the flamethrower operators would be exposed again. Another Japanese sniper took the bait, firing toward one of their false targets. The bullet hit the sand inches from the earlier crater. The timing was perfect. Too perfect to ignore. The officer lowered the radio slowly. Deliberately. As if choosing not to answer just yet. He gave the rifleman and the Marine beside him a long, unreadable look. There was no approval in it. No support. But there was something else, something closer to grim acceptance. A quiet acknowledgement of a battlefield truth: sometimes saving lives meant breaking rules. He motioned with his hand, subtle but clear, "Keep firing." The rifleman inhaled shakily. The Marine beside him tightened his grip and fired again, striking another random slab of volcanic stone. The officer followed with another deceptive shot of his own. 3 rifles, 1 rhythm of lies. The Japanese response was immediate. Sniper rounds struck the false positions again and again, each one pulled away from the flamethrower operators now inches from the bunker's outer wall. But the radio sounded again, more urgent this time. Command wasn't waiting. Suspicion was rising. The officer's jaw clenched. He pressed the radio to his mouth, and prepared to answer. Before he could speak, a sudden scream erupted from the ridge. The flamethrower team had reached the bunker. The scream rising from the ridge wasn't one of fear, it was a shout of action, the kind that meant the flamethrower team had finally reached their target. The bunker loomed in front of them like the open mouth of some ancient creature, its darkness hiding snipers, machine gunners, and men willing to die rather than surrender. The fuel tank on the operator's back gleamed faintly as he slid into position, crouched low, preparing the nozzle. But the rifleman knew this was the most dangerous moment. A flamethrower operator was never more exposed than in the seconds before igniting a bunker. The enemy knew it too. Snipers waited for this instant, the exact heartbeat before fire erupted. It was the moment Japanese marksmen trained for, the moment they considered their highest duty, stopping the flame before it ignited their positions. And now, the deception had to hold. The rifleman felt the tension in his bones. Sweat collected on his brow, running down into his eyes, mixing with dust and salt. His breathing grew shallow. His rifle grew heavier. Every sense sharpened as if the world had narrowed into one question. Would the snipers discover the truth now? He fired another deceptive shot. The Marine beside him followed. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second, then fired as well. Their irregular rhythm echoed across the ridge, 3 scattered voices of gunfire painting a false picture of movement. The Japanese snipers reacted instantly. 2 rifles cracked from inside the bunker tunnels, both aimed at the false targets. Sand and rock burst in harmless explosions. The deception still worked. But the officer's radio crackled again, this time with a sharper, angrier voice. The tone was unmistakable, command was demanding answers now, not later. The officer pressed the radio close to his mouth, his face turned away so the rifleman couldn't read his expression. The seconds ticked painfully. The flamethrower operator pulled the ignition lever. A low metallic click. A soft hissing sound. Then the nozzle brightened. The rifleman stopped breathing. If even one sniper realized the true position now, the operator would die instantly. The bunker's defenders would jump at the opportunity, every man inside understood how devastating that flame could be. They'd abandon deception. They'd focus every eye on the real threat. A single mistake would expose everything. Then it happened. A sniper fired, but not at the flamethrower. The bullet struck one of the officer's false targets, sending another plume of dust skyward. The deception had not only held, it had deepened. The Japanese were convinced all 3 Marines were covering for a flanking team, not the flamethrower closing in on them. The officer finally spoke into the radio. A short message. Calm. Controlled. He reported engagement with enemy snipers and requested temporary communication silence due to heavy counterfire. Vague enough to avoid suspicion. Formal enough to satisfy command, for now. Behind them, the flamethrower ignited. A stream of fire roared forward, illuminating the bunker's entrance with blinding heat. The island shook with the sound. Flames curled into the darkness, consuming the oxygen inside the tunnel. Screams echoed briefly, then disappeared. The deception had bought the operator the seconds he needed. The rifleman closed his eyes for a moment. Relief washed over him, but only for a heartbeat. Because with the bunker now burning, command would expect a report. Explanations. Clarifications. And the closer officers came, the harder it would be to hide the truth. As the fire lit the ridge in orange glow, the officer turned toward him, expression unreadable, as if weighing whether to protect him or report him. The flames died down slowly, leaving behind a thick, rolling cloud of smoke that spilled from the bunker's mouth like breath from a wounded beast. The flamethrower operator stepped back, exhausted, the weight of the fuel tanks dragging at his shoulders. The screams had faded. The bunker was silent now, too silent. Even in victory, the quiet felt heavy, as if the island itself was holding its breath. The rifleman wiped sweat from his forehead, though the air around him remained thick and humid. His muscles trembled from tension he hadn't acknowledged until this moment. He had saved the operator, there was no doubt now. Without the deception, the flamethrower team would have never reached the entrance alive. And yet, relief didn't feel like relief. It felt like another layer of fear. Because victory raised questions. Command expected clarity after every assault. And clarity was the one thing that would destroy him. The officer stood a few feet away, staring at the burnt bunker, his expression unreadable. The radio hung loosely from his hand now, silent. He hadn't reported the truth, but he hadn't protected the rifleman either. He simply existed in a space between duty and instinct, between regulations and the undeniable reality of what he had witnessed. The Marine beside the rifleman swallowed hard, his face still pale under the film of sand and sweat. He understood too. What they did wasn't something that could be explained without consequences. A battlefield might forgive strange decisions, but the military command system never did. It needed order. Certainty. Obedience. A sudden burst of machine gun fire erupted from deeper inside the ridge. Not aimed at them, some other squad was engaging, but the sound jolted them back into motion. The officer tightened his jaw and signaled for them to maintain position and continue covering fire. But something had changed. The Japanese snipers, stunned by the unexpected bunker breach, were scrambling to reposition. The deception had thrown their perception off balance for critical minutes, but now the battlefield was shifting again. The rifleman knew he couldn't continue the deception much longer. Chaos worked in his favor when the plan was fresh, but repetition made patterns visible, even irregular patterns. If he kept firing off beat, someone would challenge him. Someone would demand explanation. And the officer's silence couldn't shield him forever. Still, he fired another deceptive shot. A short burst aimed at a harmless patch of black sand. The Marine next to him followed his lead with a quick crack of his rifle. But this time, no Japanese shot answered. The rifleman's stomach twisted. Had the enemy realized the truth? Had they shifted their aim back toward the flamethrower team? He scanned the ridge, eyes sharp, heart pounding. The silence from the enemy side was worse than bullets. It meant adaptation. It meant the lie was no longer fooling them, or worse, they were preparing for something bigger. The officer looked toward the tunnels, his face tensing. He raised a hand, motioning for them to hold fire and listen. For a few seconds, the battlefield fell into a strange, uncomfortable hush. Then, from deep inside the volcanic rock, a faint metallic sound echoed. Not a rifle. Not a shout. Something being moved, repositioned, prepared. A new threat was rising. And the riflemen realized that breaking the rules had bought them time, but may have triggered something far more dangerous inside the tunnels. The metallic sound from inside the tunnels grew louder, slow, dragged, deliberate. Every Marine in the area stiffened, rifles raised, breath held. The rifleman felt the tension coil inside him like a wire about to snap. He'd faced sniper fire, explosions, and the burning breath of flamethrowers, but this sound was different. It carried purpose. Intention. Something preparing itself in the darkness. The officer crouched lower, signaling for everyone to stay silent. Even the flamethrower operator, still catching his breath, froze in place. Smoke drifted lazily from the bunker mouth, mixing with the strange metallic echoes. The rifleman's heartbeat seemed to match the rhythm, slow, heavy, thunderous in his ears. Then, as if the island itself exhaled, the truth spilled out from the tunnel. A Japanese sniper, alive, unburned, stumbled through the smoke. Not crawling. Not hiding. Running. He carried no rifle. No pistol. His hands were empty. His eyes were wild. And he wasn't charging toward them. He was fleeing. Running away from the deeper tunnels. The officer blinked in confusion. The Marines held their fire, unsure. Even the rifleman hesitated. This was no ambush. This was fear. Raw, unmistakable fear. Then they saw why. A second Japanese soldier burst out, this one clutching a scorched rifle and limping heavily. He looked over his shoulder in terror, shouting something in a frantic voice. His words were lost in the smoke, but the emotion was clear. They weren't escaping the Americans. They were escaping something inside their own bunker. The officer lifted his rifle, preparing to give the order to fire on the fleeing soldiers, but before he could speak, the rifleman finally understood the twist, the truth he hadn't seen before. The flamethrower hadn't forced the snipers to reposition. The deception had. By creating false firing lanes, the rifleman unintentionally convinced the Japanese defenders that multiple American squads were surrounding the tunnels from different angles. They believed an encirclement was forming. They weren't reacting to a flamethrower assault, they were reacting to a phantom force, created entirely by his off-pattern shots. And now, the surviving men inside the tunnels, unable to track the lie he built, were abandoning their posts, fleeing deeper into the complex, or out toward the open, hoping to escape a threat that didn't exist. It wasn't just that he had saved the flamethrower team. He had broken the rhythm of the battlefield so completely, that the enemy believed their defensive line had collapsed. The rifleman swallowed hard. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him, guilt, pride, fear, and something darker, the weight of knowing he had changed the course of the encounter without ever intending to. The officer turned toward him slowly, as if finally connecting every piece. The strange firing. The deception. The precise timing. The unexpected collapse of enemy resistance. A realization settled in the officer's eyes. Not anger. Not judgment. But something like respect. Silent respect. Because now he understood, the rifleman's disobedience didn't just save one team. It broke the enemy. But understanding didn't erase the consequences, command was still waiting for answers, and lies didn't disappear just because they worked. The fleeing Japanese soldiers vanished into the haze, swallowed by the chaos they thought surrounded them. For a moment, no one moved. The battlefield held an uneasy stillness, like the air before a storm breaks. The rifleman stared into the drifting smoke where the enemy had been, trying to comprehend the strange mixture of triumph and dread twisting inside his chest. He had forced the enemy to retreat with lies. Not bullets. Not brute strength. Patterns. Patterns he had broken. Patterns he had rebuilt. Patterns the enemy trusted too much. The Marine beside him exhaled shakily, leaning back against the sand mound as if realizing only now how close they had all come to disaster. The officer lowered his rifle, but his expression didn't soften. The truth weighed heavily on him. He had to answer for what happened. And so did the rifleman. The radio crackled again, filling the silence with sharp static. This time, the voice on the other end was angrier, more demanding. Command wanted a report on the irregular fire activity. It wanted confirmation of the situation in the bunker. It wanted answers. Precise answers. The officer didn't respond immediately. He looked out over the scorched ridge, the shifting smoke, the empty firing lanes where the Japanese snipers had once waited with perfect discipline. Everything about the battlefield had changed, and all of it traced back to the rifleman's decision. The officer turned toward him. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The battlefield had delivered its own explanation. He had seen the deceptive shots. He had seen the Japanese reaction. He had seen the bunker fall. He had seen the enemy flee phantoms. He finally spoke, low, steady, the kind of voice only men who had survived too much could use. Hold position. 2 simple words. Heavy with meaning. Hold position, while he decided what to tell command. Hold position, while the battlefield stabilized. Hold position, because the truth was a weapon that needed to be handled carefully. The flamethrower operator limped back toward the line, soot covering his face, eyes hollow from exhaustion. When he passed the rifleman, he gave a small nod, hesitant, unsure why he was still alive, but deeply grateful nonetheless. A nod from a man who had no idea what had been done for him. But gratitude didn't erase consequences. A shout from down the line signaled the arrival of another officer, one higher in rank. He was marching toward them with purpose, boots pounding against the volcanic sand, suspicion written across his posture. He had heard the radio chatter. He wanted answers. The rifleman felt a cold wave wash over him. This was the moment he feared since the first deceptive shot. The Marine beside him tensed, gripping his rifle as if preparing for a different kind of fight, the kind fought with words instead of bullets. The officer they worked with straightened, tightening his jaw, preparing to step into the role of explanation, or judgment. The approaching officer stopped only a few feet away. His eyes raked across the rifleman's position, the scattered false impact marks, the direction of their barrels. He saw too much. He understood too quickly. He opened his mouth to speak. But before he could demand an answer, distant explosions shook the ridge, interrupting the confrontation at the very last second. The explosion tore through the ridge like a sudden roar from the heart of the island. Smoke and dust rushed upward, obscuring the entire horizon in seconds. The shockwave hit them hard, pushing sand into their faces, rattling helmets, forcing every Marine to hit the ground. Even the senior officer staggered, instinctively lowering his head as debris flew. For a moment, the confrontation vanished under the weight of raw survival. Bullets stopped. Orders died in throats. Every man reacted to the primal truth of war, stay low or die. The rifleman pressed himself into the volcanic sand, heart hammering. The sudden blast felt different from artillery, closer, sharper, deeper inside the island's structure. It wasn't aimed at them. It was the enemy destroying something within their own tunnels, a desperate measure, a retreat, or a trap. The senior officer recovered first. He rose to a crouch, scanning the ridge with narrowed eyes. The smoke parted just enough to reveal what happened. A secondary chamber in the tunnel system had collapsed, either from the flamethrowers' heat or from the panicked Japanese destroying their own escape routes. Shouts echoed inside the tunnels. Metal clanged. More debris fell. Whatever the reason, the blast had interrupted everything. Including the question that could end the rifleman's career, or his life. The first officer took the moment to step forward slightly, positioning himself between the rifleman and the senior officer. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but the rifleman felt it like a shield, thin, fragile, but real. The senior officer noticed. His expression hardened. He gestured sharply toward the rifleman's firing position, demanding explanation even through the chaos. The scattered false impact points. The unusual angles. The fact that their rifles had clearly not been aimed at the bunker's approach path. The evidence was too visible. Too detailed. The rifleman felt the weight of that truth bearing down on him. Before he could speak, the first officer answered instead. Calm. Measured. Professional. He reported heavy sniper fire, misleading echoes from the volcanic terrain, and confusion caused by shifting enemy positions. A carefully crafted explanation, strategic enough to offer clarity, vague enough to protect the truth. The senior officer didn't buy it. Not fully. His eyes narrowed. He scanned each Marine one by one, studying their faces. Doubt clung to him like smoke. But just as he opened his mouth to press further, another sound emerged from the tunnels, this time a steady, rhythmic clanging. The Japanese were sealing deeper chambers, trapping themselves further inside the island. It was desperate, illogical, but also the clearest sign yet that their defensive line had collapsed. The senior officer turned his head sharply toward the sound. Even he couldn't ignore that. A collapsing tunnel network meant an opportunity, and command valued opportunity more than interrogations. He barked an order. Advance and secure the ridge. A wave of relief washed through the rifleman's chest, relief so sharp it almost hurt. The confrontation had been postponed, maybe even avoided entirely. The battlefield's chaos had bought him more time. The Marines moved forward cautiously. The rifleman followed, still shaken. The first officer didn't look at him, but his silence carried a message. You're not safe yet. But you're not alone either. The Japanese defenders were breaking. Not from fire. Not from numbers. From a pattern they couldn't understand. And the rifleman knew that once the ridge was secured, explanations would return. As they advanced through swirling smoke, the senior officer stopped suddenly, staring at a strange object half buried in the sand, something that could expose the entire deception. The senior officer froze mid-stride, his boot nudging something half buried in the volcanic sand. The object was small, metallic, oddly positioned, too clean to be debris, too intentional to be ignored. The rifleman felt his stomach twist. Even before the officer bent down, he knew what it was. A spent casing. But not just any casing. A casing from his rifle, lying in a place no American rifle should have been aiming toward. The senior officer crouched, brushing the black sand aside with two gloved fingers. More casings emerged, several of them, all clustered around a rock that had no tactical value whatsoever. Each one was a silent accusation. A fingerprint of disobedience recorded in brass. The officer lifted one casing between his fingers, studying it with a cold, analytical stare. The battlefield noise faded into the background. The rifleman felt the air thicken. A part of him wanted to step back, bury himself in the sand, vanish into the smoke. But there was no hiding from something so solid. So undeniable. The Marine beside him tensed. The first officer's expression tightened, understanding exactly what the senior officer was thinking. Why were these men firing at empty stones? Why was ammunition wasted? Why were so many shots aimed away from the enemy approach? And the deeper question, buried beneath all of them. Had someone disobeyed orders in the middle of combat? The senior officer turned slowly toward the rifleman. His eyes were sharp, cold, and heavy with expectation. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was calculating. Officers didn't jump to conclusions. They built them piece by piece, and right now, he held the first piece. Before he could speak, a sudden noise echoed from inside the bunker tunnels. Not an explosion. Not machinery. Voices. Weak, distant, panicked Japanese voices calling to each other, their words carrying on the shifting wind. They weren't preparing an ambush. They were collapsing deeper into the maze. Retreating. Disoriented. Completely fooled. The sound pulled the senior officer's attention for only a moment, but it was enough for the first officer to act. He stepped forward slightly, placing himself between the senior officer and the rifleman, again, subtle, careful, almost respectful. But unmistakably protective. He spoke quickly, crafting a narrative with the calm confidence of a man who understood command psychology. He explained that during the heavy sniper engagement, multiple Marines had fired suppressive shots to create audio confusion, masking the flamethrower team's approach. He framed the strange angles as intentional battlefield adaptation, not disobedience. The senior officer listened, expression unreadable. He turned the casing in his fingers, considering the explanation, weighing logic against instinct. The rifleman felt his pulse in his throat. The lie was close to the truth, close enough to survive, maybe, but fragile. One more question could shatter everything. Then, unexpectedly, a burst of fire erupted from deep inside the tunnels, Japanese weapons firing blindly into walls as they retreated. The sound echoed like a desperate animal thrashing in its cage. The senior officer's head snapped toward the tunnels. That sound validated the story. If the Japanese were disoriented, reacting to imaginary positions, the explanation made sense. For the first time, doubt left his face. He dropped the casing back into the sand. And without a word, he turned away, signaling the Marines to continue securing the ridge. The rifleman exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His arms trembled, not from fear of the enemy, but from the weight of what almost happened. The first officer looked at him briefly, his eyes carrying a silent warning. This is over for now. But not forgotten. The ridge was almost theirs. The enemy was collapsing. But the truth, his truth, still hung in the air like smoke. And as they pushed forward, he realized the hardest part was still ahead, explaining his actions to himself when the battle ended. When the ridge finally fell silent, the smoke began to lift in slow, drifting waves. The sun, weak behind a curtain of gray, cast a faint light across the black volcanic sand. The battlefield looked different now. Not calmer, not safer, just emptied. Like the aftermath of a long argument the earth itself had survived. The rifleman stood among the scattered debris, his rifle hanging loosely by his side. His hands still trembled, though the fighting had ended. Around him, Marines moved with practiced efficiency, counting casualties, checking supplies, clearing the last pockets of resistance. Their voices were low, subdued, carrying the weight of a battle that had demanded too much from all of them. The flamethrower operator sat on a broken slab of stone, helmet off, face blackened by soot. He stared at the rifleman for a long moment. Not with confusion now, only gratitude. It wasn't the gratitude of someone who understood what had happened. It was the gratitude of someone who knew he should be dead, yet was still breathing the heavy air of Iwo Jima. But the rifleman felt no pride. Only a strange hollowness. A quiet ache. He had broken the rules. He had fired against protocol. He had deceived both the enemy and his own command. And he had lived through the consequences, barely. The first officer approached, his boots sinking slightly into the sand. He stopped beside the rifleman, looking out over the smoke-stained ridge. No words of praise. No reprimand. Just silence, an acknowledgement that some actions lived outside the clean borders of military doctrine. After a moment, he spoke quietly, without turning his head. You changed the outcome here. Just don't expect anyone to thank you for it. The rifleman nodded slowly. He didn't expect thanks. He didn't expect recognition. The battlefield wasn't a place for heroes, it was a place where men survived by instinct, by fear, by decisions no one would ever write down. He looked toward the tunnel entrance, now collapsed and dark. Inside, the remnants of an enemy force still fought their own battles against confusion and fear, battles shaped entirely by his deception. They had been defeated not by firepower, but by a pattern broken at the right moment. He wondered if anyone would ever understand that. Probably not. And maybe that was for the best. A cold wind swept across the ridge, carrying ash and dust. The rifleman closed his eyes briefly, letting it wash over him. The weight of what he had done would stay with him long after the war ended. Not guilt alone, not pride alone, but a mixture too complex to name. He had saved lives. He had broken rules. He had walked the narrow line between execution and survival, and no one would ever truly know it. As the Marines prepared to move deeper into the island, the rifleman lifted his rifle again. The battle was over, but the war was not. And this secret, this silent, forbidden choice, would follow him through every step that remained. Not as a burden. Not as a victory. but as a reminder of the day he discovered that sometimes the difference between life and death is a single shot fired in the wrong direction. If you want more stories like this, watch the next video.